just interested in sports, they go to a website that's just about sports, and they don't learn what's happening in their community and in the world. That's the danger, and it's mainly a danger, I think, for people who have relatively low political interest. The people who have intense political interest, yes, they will find out about the news. They'll find out about the world. But there will be, I think, there already is, erosion among people who have very limited interests, and they will become less informed, and that may really affect the quality of democracy because they may be able less to make sense of the world and even to express their interests intelligently when they vote.
Just as an example, an American example that's very noteworthy is we have had a news magazine sector, weekly news magazines, our equivalent of Der Spiegel. So there were 3 players. One has essentially died and exited the field entirely. Socially, they perform some of this function I'm just describing. That's why I'm using them as an example. The second has just been sold for $1. And the third is at about half the circulation it had, 20 years ago. So that's just, it's more than just an anecdote. There seems to be some evidence that the commercial viability of that notion of journalism may be shrinking somewhat or may be limited to a few organizations. But what I'm really interested in is that a problem for democracy? Do you want to?
I think it is.
Yep.
I certainly agree with what Paul's had to, just said. It's entirely possible on the internet for an individual to feel relatively well educated while being only exposed to information that confirms his prejudices. And I think more and more that's happening, and that is a cause for anxiety. And you add to that the kind of rising temperature of discourse, fanned by the shouting heads on some of the cable TV programs, and it does make you worry. It makes me worry, and I know it makes Paul worry, about the kind of civil political discourse that you have to sustain a democracy. I console myself to some extent that this idea of an impartial, trustworthy and national media with a wide exposure is a relatively new one in American history. We've survived earlier periods of partisan press, yellow press, localized press, no press, and have muddled through. But that's obviously examining the problem through my optimist lens, which I brought for this occasion.
Do any of the others want to comment on this?
But I answer to your question with another question. Why in these years, that are the years of internet, the power is intolerant of the press, of newspaper? I think it's not the piece of news that is important for the power, but the general look, the community built around the newspaper through the ideas, the general ideas of newspapers. And you could say that the power has been always intolerant of the press. But let me say about these last years in Italy. In the last 15 years, all the paradigm, the actors, and the context of the public speech have changed. The ruling political culture in my country today is a sort of modern populism. And that is particularly suitable for these times of disorientation, loss of reference, loss of certitude, actually loss of citizenship. Politics was invented to untie the knots of complexity, and it's a tiring, anonymous work that can easily become unpopular because it's laborious, drab, and sometimes is ineffectual. Populism gives us the illusion of being able to cut all these knots with his sword, which is the sword of command without adjectives, but also without checks and balances. And it's very spectacular work that can easily become very popular because it is simple in its energy, elementary. Obviously, populism, when it's in charge, needs no examination, no supervision, no controls, and above all, no concurrent powers. It is precisely for this reason that populism is intolerant of the press. I think ours is the only country in the world where the Prime Minister has openly invited on TV the population to refuse newspapers, not to read them, but follow only television that he controls entirely by political control of public networks, by direct and personal control of private networks, which he owns and has never wanted to cast off since he has taken political power. It's easy to understand that for all this reason, there's a specific anomaly today in Italy in the relationship between the power and the press. Always difficult, but never so difficult. Because today, the intolerance for freedom of press, for criticism, for journalistic investigation, for all the questions, is a constitutive element of this kind of power, its nature, its character, and above all, its culture. Populism, indeed, does not conceive public opinion, only common sense that the populism creates, fits, and interprets. This happens because populism addresses not to citizens, but directly to the people, to whom the power asks not for participation, which is always and wherever an instrument of citizenship, but only a good vibration for consensus. So politics becomes simply an event, the leader becomes an idol, the numbers give him the charisma, as Bauman said, and popularity replaces opinion, replaces reputation, celebrity takes the place of respect, citizens become spectators, and public opinion changes in mere audience. That is evidently another thing. We understand that newspapers in the Western world work in opposite direction. Newspapers work to build public opinion, to offer the readers the possibility of becoming real citizens through information and knowledge that makes the citizen informed and aware. Therefore, we can say that democracy has a typographic mentality because it dreams of informed citizens, readers of newspaper. Instead, populism has a television mentality to speak directly to the people, overstepping citizen and newspaper that work together in the democratic process of building public opinion. This is our problem today. This is our challenge. But because populism can quickly become a modern recipe for democracy tired by the difficulty of the complexity, perhaps that this bell tolls certainly for us, but not only for us.
Thank you. Paul, let me turn to you for a bracing dose of pessimism. Let's say there is general agreement on the panel. There's some disagreement about this platform question, but there's general love of journalism, and there's also, I think, a general consensus that everybody likes the idea of professionalized news organizations that command large audiences, and that this isn't only good for those organizations and those who choose to, can ingest their products, but it's good for democracy itself. Let's say you're right that this particular formation is economically endangered. What do we do next? What do we do about it? You alluded to this briefly in your opening remarks, but I want to sort of drill down on some of the possible remedies.
Well, I hope that Bill is right and Bodo is right, that the media will solve this problem, that new opportunities will develop and sources of revenue to support journalism will be there, and we will end up on a stable plateau after all of this turmoil. But it may be necessary to develop new sources of support. And here's where I think the United States may be ideologically disabled, because such a strong bias has been built into both journalism and politics against any kind of public support for the press. Now, actually, early in American history, the government did support the development of the press through subsidies in postal rates that were very significant in the early development of newspapers in the United States. But it has become almost unthinkable today to have any kind of support, even though in many countries in Europe, there are sources of support that don't undermine the autonomy of the press. We do have examples of that in various countries. So it's not impossible, but we have to overcome that. Now, the most plausible thing to happen in the United States is to develop more nonprofit support, more philanthropic support, and that is happening now in various ways, and helping to make up for some of the deficits in investigative reporting, for example, and maybe we can get more of those. I think there are some other possibilities in our country. I don't know to what extent any of this applies elsewhere, but let me just give you an example of one thing that is about to take place in the United States over the next several years. Television spectrum is going to be shifted into use for other telecommunications, for broadband. And in the United States, this will involve the auctioning off, the sale of this spectrum. And it could be that some of the proceeds for those auctions could go to establish independent endowments for journalism. There are many public television stations in the United States. I don't know if this makes any sense to a European audience as to what I'm talking about. But these television stations are now, their audiences are mostly audiences that receive the programming through cable or satellite. They don't actually use the broadcast signal. And so that bandwidth is going to be freed up for other uses. And this represents a shift of billions of dollars in assets. The question is where that money will go. If that money can go into new endowments for journalism, it could support a form of journalism that would be independent of political manipulation. That's one possibility for doing this, which I think is plausible in the United States.
Could you discuss just a little more how these endowments would work in, just, you may not have designed them in detail, but just a little more idea. Would they in fact be endowments that are pools of capital that sit there? Who would control them, et cetera?
Well, the most practical route for this to happen involves the public television stations in the United States, which are not owned by the federal government. The licenses are mostly owned by nonprofit organizations in the states and localities. Some are owned by state governments. And if they were to receive the money from these auctions, they would be able then to support not only the traditional programming, but perhaps other forms of journalism. I think the whole distinction between television, radio, print, and so forth, all of that is going to disappear over time. And so these could become the basis for public service journalism in the United States that has never existed. So in Europe, we've had public service broadcasting. We've had a very small system like that in the United States. This could, I think, be the basis of a much stronger system to support journalism generally.
Let me take everyone else's temperature about this issue.
Well, two thoughts. First of all, I'd just add to what Paul said, that the bias against government support of the media in the United States is not just something that exists among media people. It's quite popular. And in fact, the conservatives have, with great success, rallied the populace against the funding of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.